All right, here we go. Thank you so much, everyone, for sticking it out. We're here for the last one. And good afternoon. My name is Gabriel Rader. I am an MPA student, like many of my colleagues, in the development practice concentration, so MPA DP. And here we go. Got a TP program, right. So I'll start with this. The consumer is always right. Who's heard that before? The customer is always right. The consumer's always right. Yeah, most people. Whether you're a McKinsey consultant.
Seems like there's a sound issue on Zoom right now.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Can they hear us? Marlene, can you guys hear us?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, cool. All right, if there is anybody else having trouble, please do drop it in the chat. All right, so yeah, the customer is always right, right? Whether you're a crop farmer or a McKinsey consultant, that phrase is the phrase that keeps you up at night, right? And whether it's true or not, one thing is for sure, consumers wield immense power, enough to shift the trajectory of our entire food system. As Professor Denning might say, the specific food environments within which consumers find themselves are imperative in influencing the decisions that they make. And these decisions can influence things much greater than just their health, as Dr. Fanzo showed us in session 1. It's no surprise then that this area of the value chain, that immediately surrounding consumers, serves as a critical fulcrum for leveraging great substantive change in our global food systems. However, some say consumers can't afford to pay more for higher quality food, and others that profit margins for farmers are too small to assume the risk in producing it. Challenges exist, but they can be overcome. How is what we're here today to discuss in our fourth and final session, Shifting Consumer Preferences. We have quite the lineup for you today, hailing from across the globe and value chain. Researchers, professors, industry leaders, all trailblazers, and each at the top of their field, redefining the future of food. We'll commence with an address from Dr. Marlene Anwijzen from the Netherlands. So we're really appreciative of her time, given that it's, close to 9 p.m. on a Friday night. So we're very appreciative of her time. She's a social psychologist from Wageningen Economic Research. Dr. Anwijzen manages large-scale projects focusing on consumer choices for sustainable and healthy food, aiming to answer how consumer choices can be explained and guided. Following our keynote, we'll welcome our 4 panelists. Dr. Jason Evans, here on the left, a natural resource economist hailing from West Virginia and the founding dean of Johnson & Wales University's College of Food, Innovation, and Technology. In a past life, Dr. Evans was a professor of agricultural business management and my alma mater, SUNY Cobleskill, and my mentor, really. He was chair of the Department of Agriculture and Food Management and director of the Institute for Rural Vitality throughout the Hudson Valley. Seated alongside Dr. Evans is Mr. Steve Sands, the vice president of protein for Performance Food Service. After finishing his degree at Yale, Steve became the 4th generation to operate his family's meat business, Standard Meat Co., and took it to new heights. Today, Steve is replicating this growth in PFG's protein category, which has since become the company's largest, fastest growing, and most profitable category with unique high-value economic incentive models, which I'm sure he'll delve into today. Joining us virtually are Emma Ignazuski from the Good Food Institute and Dr. Julie Kunin from Oatly. At GFI, Emma has her sights set on catalyzing corporate innovation that will radically transform the food system. Prior to the Good Food Institute, she was creating the regional TEDx events that we all know and love, and worked in strategy, marketing, and communications, as well as the health, education, and access sector, all areas that affect and are affected by our food systems. Joining her on the big screen is Dr. Kunin, a director of sustainability, the director of sustainability for Oatly North America, and her colleague, if you want to stand up, colleague from Oatly as well, Her passion for sustainability studies began with a PhD in archaeology focused on agricultural practices in the ancient Maya. Dr. Coonan went on to hold roles in academia, government, nonprofits, freelance journalism, and business consulting before joining Oatly at the end of 2020. Keeping everyone in line today is our moderator, Dr. Matthew Hyatt, an assistant professor at NYU's Department of Environmental Studies. Dr. Hayek received his PhD from the Harvard Paulson School of Engineering and Applied Sciences and is a member of the Food and Climate Partnership that we're sponsored by today and what's brought us all here together today, aiming to provide better data and frameworks for evaluating food system policies and mitigating climate change. We could not be more excited to have you all here today. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Marlene Anwiesen. And we can see, I guess, your screen already. So as long as we can hear you, let me throw this camera around a little bit and we'll get started.
Yes, thank you so much. Wonderful. And thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yeah, no, sorry, Marlene, would you mind making your presentation full screen if you could?
I thought it already was.
If not, that's okay. Help us pay attention even more when we know what's to come, right?
Share.
So you may want to click on the bottom right-hand side. If you could see my screen, I'm kind of hovering over.
Yes, he's working on it, I think.
Okay, cool. We'll just stick with this. All right, take it away.
Yes. Okay, thank you so much. I'm not sure whether it worked out, but this seems to be the only option. So thank you so much for the opportunity to present here today. In short, my ambition today is to convince all of you that consumers are not rational in their decision making, and that by only focusing on price or information on environmental consequences, we have a limited view, and that we should use these irrationalities to support behavior change. And I want to start by asking all of you to recall the last time you developed a health-related or sustainable-related personal food goal. So think for yourself, when was the last time I tried for myself to develop an ambition to become a more healthy person, or speaking for myself, to do not eat a whole bag of crisps at the evening, but just one bowl of crisps? Losing weight or gaining weight. We develop all these kinds of resolutions over time. So please think about the last time you did it. And obviously, one life I can ask you to hold hands, but now I have to state that we know by research that many of you did not succeed. And it's better to even ask not how many of you succeeded, but how long it took to fall down in old habits. What we see is that consumers really fall down very quickly. And for example, wanting to become a better, more healthy person, or not eating too much snacks, but already fall the next day when someone treats for a birthday cake. Or for example, want to become a more sustainable person, though it's raining, though they still use the car. And there are many ways to support sustainable behavior, but by only focusing on developing novel products and trying to understand what's a sustainable diet, we already know that quite well. What the most difficult part is really triggering behavior. Can we change consumers to change their lifestyles, to become a more healthy and sustainable person? And whereas we often think we are very rational decision makers and that we really weigh all the pros and cons and make deliberate choices in the supermarket, for example, in essence, we are not. We're really triggered by the environment and old habits and emotions and quick needs for example, sugar, or the environmental triggers are really influential on our behavior. And today I want to go below the surface and highlight 4 examples to show you some ideas how these irrationalities work and how we might use them to support behavior change. And I use 3 types of research we often use in our research. One example that focuses more on monitoring, one that focuses on understanding behavior. Can we understand where behavior comes from? And the third and fourth example focus more on can we use these examples to really support behavior change? So the first example, I only quickly go to these examples. I obviously don't have the time to really explain in depth what we did, though all the researches can be found online. They're all open source articles or reports. The first example, and all examples relate to reducing meat consumption, as meat consumption is a real prominent unsustainable behavior and also related to unhealthiness. So trying to reduce meat consumption and finding alternatives is a real sustainable and healthy context. And one of the researches we did was comparing the same consumers over time, showing that consumers became more open for different alternative proteins in 5 years. So we saw, for example, fish and seaweed, pulses and insects. Individuals became more open and acceptant to try to consume these alternative proteins. Still quite low, but they became more acceptant. Though this acceptance only explains less than 30% of behavior. So there's a real gap between these intentions and the behavior. And this gap between the intentions and behavior even becomes larger over time. So what we see is that these intentions and acceptance grow over the time. So people became more acceptant, though the consumption levels remain stable. And the gap between these intentions and behavior remains stable. And the high meat consumption also remains stable. And this also is what's reflected in the example we had before. So people formulate intentions. They want to become a better person. They're open for sustainable behaviors or healthy behaviors, but really performing that behavior is difficult. Can we understand where this intention comes from? And we often think that the behavioral intentions are reflected in the price, convenience, healthiness, all kinds of different motivations for food choices. Though actually these motives were not that relevant in explaining these intentions. And for example, the positive or negative attitudes, the perceptions of behavioral control, whether one can perform a certain behavior, and food neophobia, whether one is scared to try novel behaviors. I also score quite high on that one. So I also think it's quite scary to try, for example, insects. These were quite relevant in understanding intentions. The most prominent drivers were in the unconscious and affective layers. We saw that especially the social environment, so various individuals think they make individual decisions in the supermarket, they're really triggered by the social environment. So what are other people doing and how do they approve my own behavior? And they're also really triggered by emotional aspects and not that much by these cognitive aspects. And that's really relevant information to use in developing interventions. Then I included an example in which we tried to use this information to really steer behavior. We did many things in this research. We used insect burgers, all different kinds of insect burgers that varied in the level of process. So, for example, we had fresh and we had processed, but we had also chicken burgers from which the chicken consumed the insect. So it was actually quite a normal burger for consumers. So there was a range of novelty in these different protein burgers. And we varied only a very small aspect. I'm sorry it's in Dutch, but this says, the left side says, feel good about yourself and choose the healthy alternative, which is made of insects. And the right one says, essentially the same, though it starts not with feel good, but with research shows. And you see it's the same package, it's the same burger, though there's only variation in feel good about yourselves versus research shows. And what we see is that these effective emotional messages result in much more purchase intentions compared to these cognitive messages. And these emotional messages are becoming more and more important when there are more insects in the burger. So the scarier, the more novel the product becomes, the more people are going to use their feelings to make these decisions. And you can use this information to not only focus on these cognitive aspects when positioning your products, but also thinking about how does it make individuals feel. And the final example is a different example in the context of restaurants. What we did was we changed the menu in a very slight or a small manner. So individuals have the same options, though we changed. So in this case, you see that the standard option is a classic meat burger. And individuals can ask for a vegetarian option, but they have to ask the waiter. So that was the one condition. And in the other condition, we turned that around. So then the standard option is the vegetarian burger. And if you prefer a classic meat burger, you have to ask the waiter. And what we see is that whereas individuals actually have the same opportunity, they can choose both sides. So they can choose a meat burger or a vegetarian burger. You can see that if the meat burger is the standard option, 80% chooses the meat burger and only 11% chooses the vegetarian burger. And when we turn it around, we see that 60% chooses the meat burger and 27% chooses the vegetarian burger. So it almost doubles by changing the standard option, which is interesting because actually individuals remain to have the same freedom of choice. So what we saw is that consumers are not always rational in their decision making. They do not always weigh all the pros and cons, and they also use a lot of unconscious and affective triggers from the environment. Though we can understand what's going on, and this is predictable, and we can use this information to develop interventions that change behavior towards more sustainable and healthy choices. And that was the presentation. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much, Gabriel. And thank you so much for that wonderful keynote, Marlene. I think that's a really refreshing reminder that there is, in fact, a lot of latitude in consumer behavior. We just haven't always been thinking about pulling the right levers for a group of people that we generally tend to think of as very stubborn or set in their ways at the supermarket, at restaurants, and when they're purchasing their meals. So I want to keep this as open as possible in the beginning and maybe narrow down into some subjects. And maybe if we could go around, starting with the folks we have here and then our virtual panelists, to ask a little bit about the role of policy in all this. Each one of us are coming from different positions of working in the private sector, working in academia, history of working with public sectors. But for those thinking about your positions now, what's one policy option that you feel like we need at a local, federal scale, any scale you can think of that would make it easier to scale your respective missions? And I'm going to start with Steve here. And maybe in the midst of that, if you could say a little bit about what you do with Performance Food Group and where the policy landscape has some options to kind of enable or accelerate what you're doing.
You bet. Well, it's a pleasure to be here today, folks. I think it's extremely important as future leaders in food industry, ag industry, and climate protection that we seriously consider the role of agriculture, because it's going to be hard to make serious impacts without considering agriculture. Now, Performance Food Group, we're a company that sells about $52 billion annually of food products. We're the second largest food distributor in the country. I run their meat category, beef, pork, and poultry, which in our universe is about a $15.5 billion book of business. And what we've tried to do is we've tried to create change through financial incentives. And we have found it's very difficult to get people to pay more money for a steak if they know it's raised in an environmentally sensitive way. So what we've tried to do is create brands across the various species, pork, poultry, beef, where we focus on the eating quality of the product because we know people will pay more for better eating quality. And then we focus on those production practices that are environmentally friendly, but also encourage better quality product. And oftentimes those two go hand in hand. Temple Grandin taught us all that a happier animal makes better beef, right? And so we have a lot of specifications now in our products, limiting the animal's distance to market, what the animal eats, unapproved drugs, market weights that are lighter, so we're not making them so heavy, all those kinds of things. But we've motivated the behavior of the consumer by focusing on eating quality, selling it for more money, and then returning some of that money to the farmers for better production practices. Policies often act negatively. They're well-intended. For example, right now, there is a lot of money out there for small packing houses. And that was generated in the infrastructure bill, and it was generated because, a year ago, we didn't have meat on the shelves, right? Or 2 years ago. And so the concept was, okay, we'll put a lot of money out there. We'll have more local meat plants. The problem is those small plants have a production cost that's about $300 per head higher than the large plants. So the bogey that it gives those animals in terms of cost is significant. And those smaller plants can't harvest every aspect of that animal. The large plants, they make use out of the bones, the blood, the eyeballs, they're spinning pharmaceutical products, all that kind of stuff. They can't do that in small plants. So here's a policy that's actually $1 billion is earmarked. And most of that money is going to go down the drain in form of enterprises that are built, that are financially unsustainable, and eventually are mothballed.
That's really interesting. And you're bringing up a much larger problem of accidental trade-offs in environmental and food system policies, which is something that we in the Food Climate Partnership spend a lot of time focusing on and worrying about, that you have something at a local scale that might improve a particular farm or look like it improves a particular farm or a certain value add, but across the system can lead to some pretty large unintended consequences. I'm interested in what you're saying about what the alternative is, if that's the case, but I'm wondering if we all have the ability to stomach any more conversation as a group about slaughterhouses for now. So maybe we can get to it a little later after lunch.
That's right.
But that is very interesting. Thank you so much, Steve. So Jason, let me move that question to you in your very different role and position. So maybe if you could say a little bit about that and what types of challenges you're thinking about in the policy landscape.
Sure. So being the dean at Johnson & Wales, which is really one of the two largest culinary food-centric, everything you can imagine food programming institution in the country, it also means that we on any given day are one of the largest food service organizations in the country. Food that we move through our labs and our courses every single day is incredible. And PFG, as it turns out, is one of our major broadline distributors. So I'm at the helm of an organization that not only uses a lot of food, but it teaches the leaders of tomorrow's food system. And I think that that's an incredibly enormous responsibility. Historically, students would have come to Johnson & Wales because they want to be a chef at a 3 Michelin star restaurant. They want to be on Food Network. And we still have those students. But the message now to our students is you have more buying power than anybody else in the food system because you're out at hospitality organizations, resorts, and restaurants. You can change the food system with your buying behavior and with the foods that you're putting out to consumers. So we're really treating our students who become chefs and restaurateurs and nutritionists and performance chefs and product developers, that you will change the food system. And I would have to share Steve's skepticism about policy, being able to change the food system in the way that those private sector actors can. And as a couple of examples, the National School Lunch Program. I mean, it is incredibly well intended. And my goodness, it's the reason why children all over the country for 90 years have gotten at least 1 to 2 square meals a day, no matter their income. Really look into school lunch, though. What are those kids eating, especially in the poorest parts of this country? How many schools in this country don't actually have kitchen facilities and rely on food service management companies that are making food offsite? It's horrible when it gets to the school. The National School Lunch Program has not in any way engendered better food system outcomes because it is in no way developing better eating habits at 6 and 7 years old. And then follow those kids the rest of their lives. I'd say the same thing about the farmers market incentive programs through SNAP, where we're going to put $1 billion on the table to double every dollar that a SNAP user spends on fruits and vegetables at farmers markets. My goodness, it's free money. People are going to flock to this. Not really. The SNAP users who are already coming to the farmers market, which aren't that many, benefited, no question about it. The program never actually net impacted the number of people buying fruits and vegetables from the local system. The problem with policy is that policy is always going to be reluctant to do something that forces change in what people are buying. And so more often than not, that policy falls on the producer side. There are fewer producers. They're easier to legislate than 300 million consumers. And we see that. We see all kinds of regulation, all kinds of incentive programs and otherwise on the producer side. But I don't know that it moves the needle on what we eat and how we eat very well.
Thank you for that. A lot more richness there about unintended trade-offs with respect to public policy, and a good reminder that consumers are not just us as individuals going to a grocery store or a restaurant. Consumers are themselves can be very large institutions purchasing at scale, a business purchasing from another business. And maybe there's some latitude here to think about what are the private policies for those institutional purchasers rather than what's a government policy that is going to kind of affect things much more horizontally and lead to unintended consequences for producers as well. So thank you very much for that. I also want to turn this larger question about policy to our very different and diverse participants online here. So maybe we could start with you, Julie. It would be fantastic to hear more about what you're working on with Oatly and some of the role of public policy, either desirable or undesirable, that you see in helping your and your company's mission.
Great, thank you. You can hear me okay, right?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much for having me. Hey, everybody in the invisible audience and my fellow panelists. I'm really, really happy to be with you today. Just briefly for folks who might not be familiar with Oatly, we're the original and largest now in the world oat drink company, founded in the 80s in Sweden by a group of researchers who were looking for a plant-based, nutritious, and delicious drink that had qualities similar to the milks that are made from cow's milk, but for people who were intolerant to traditional dairy, and since then has grown, of course, to be a world-class, plant-based alternative to dairy. The company itself embraces the values of plant-based eating. and is striving to provide delicious products that enable people to have real moments of joy in their lives without either harming their own health or recklessly taxing the planet's resources. So that is the company where I work. I'm the director of sustainability for Oatly in North America. And in that role, I think a lot about, of course, the role of agriculture and agricultural policy, because, of course, we are a company that depends in very large part on oats. Oats, as we all know, are a very important agricultural commodity that we source in this hemisphere. So, I would say two things about the policy question that's on the table. I mean, one is that in the face of the climate emergency that this world is facing and the enormous role the global food industry plays as a major greenhouse gas emitter, government policy is important, but we don't have time to wait for the international community to get its act together and to make the decisions that they make at these global conferences in order to have impact. And we don't have to wait. The power, as our keynote presenter sort of mentioned, the power of individuals and the companies that sell products to them to change the way we think about eating and the way people make the daily choices of what they put in their mouths in terms of food and beverage can collectively have enormous impact. So, we start from the premise of we operate in a very, very complex global food system that has many, many policy components to it. And we can't wait for those all to be in line. And as a mission-driven company, we are going to move as quickly as we can towards providing the world with a much more sustainable alternative and advocating for the changes in the food system that need to, right the inequities, both planetary and human-wise, that we know exist. But I think the other thing that I would say is, and my colleague on the panel who talked about school lunches, raises a point that we wholeheartedly agree with, is that, the policy world that we live in for agriculture in this country has not created a level playing field, right? There are massive incentives in the system that incentivize commodity agriculture, that incentivize animal-based, industrial agriculture, and the plant-based community, which, most research shows that plant-based foods are much less damaging to the planet than their animal alternatives, have not benefited from a level policy playing field. And of course, the role of milk in school lunches is just one example of that. So I would say we would seek more equity in the policy landscape, and independent of what governments and government policy are doing, we ourselves are pursuing our own mission.
Thank you very much for that, Julie. And lastly, I would like to move this over to Emma, who is the last person we've got to hear from to contribute it to. I know that Good Food Institute is pulling a lot of potential policy levers at the same time that you are also adopting this approach that Julie is focusing on, which is working with the private sector because the climate, the food system can't wait. So I would love to hear a little bit more about how you with Good Food Institute are attempting to strike that balance. And again, what your role is and your larger mission with Good Food Institute for the audience who is new to that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. So hi, everyone. I'm Emma Ignashevsky, and I work on the corporate engagement team at the Good Food Institute. And GFI is a global network of nonprofits that are accelerating the alternative protein industry. So hearkening back to the sort of consumer framing of the session that Marlene sort of positioned us in, given that taste and price determine what most people eat, GFI is working around the world to make alternative proteins as delicious and affordable and accessible as conventional meat. So with alternative proteins, we can make proteins directly from plants. We can make them from fermentation technology or by using animal cell culture. We call this cultivated meat. And by changing how meat is made, we can seize the opportunity to produce food that people love and usher in a more sustainable, secure, and just food future. And to your question about policy, one of the policy interventions that we would like to see is a clear path to market for cultivated meat. As Julie talked about, this sort of goes hand in hand with a level playing field for some of these newer or newly applied food technologies. So one of the three primary platforms of alternative proteins is this cultivated meat category. It's genuine animal meat. It's made by growing animal cells outside of the animal. It's actually grown usually in facilities that look like a brewery at scale. So cultivated meat saw its first commercial launch in 2020 in Singapore. But we haven't seen it. We haven't seen it being sold in other locations yet, other geographies. And the sale of cultivated meat and seafood depends on this clear regulatory path to market. So companies and governments really have to work together to successfully develop effective regulatory regimes. So in addition to Singapore, other countries are making strides in the race to approve and invest in these products. You know, in the US, we've seen the USDA and the FDA released a formal agreement that outlines their respective regulatory roles for cultivated livestock and poultry meat. But the question, you know, still remains. There's a lot of activity out there and conversations happening about labeling. And the question remains, you know, with the blessing of regulators, when will the first cultivated meat product come to market in the US?
All right. Thank you very much for that. I do at one point want to get back to Marlene about what I hear as a little bit of dissonance between what the drivers are for consumption of food. Good Food Institute has as its mission to work on the taste, price, and convenience of these alternative proteins. And Marlene, I heard you say during your contribution that those aren't necessarily the largest drivers of consumer decision-making and behavior, that they can be some irrational or unintuitive things, including food neophobia, social drivers, and emotion. So I would like to hear a little bit more about that. Are we giving too much credit to taste, price, and convenience? Or how do you think about this balance between rational and irrational factors driving consumer behaviors?
Yes, thank you for your question. Indeed, so price, tastiness, convenience are very relevant drivers of consumption. And especially when you ask consumers what they think is important, these drivers always pop up as the most relevant drivers. Though, indeed, the focus, by only focusing on these drivers, we take a very limited approach because the amount of possibilities to support behavior change is much broader. And just providing one example, if you're positioning your project as a vegetarian product, a lot of individuals think it's not that tasty. So there are a lot of associations and assumptions present, which are more in the subconscious. And by, for example, stating that it's a flame grilled bean burger or some more affect-related, taste-related positioning, the total experience of the product is really triggered. And that happens this is an example related to taste, and that happens on all these different drivers. So also on the aspects of social norms, we see a lot of unconscious triggers in the supermarket that really trigger that consuming meat is the standard and regular thing to do. If you enter the supermarket, there are a lot of shelves with all meat, and the shelves with meat alternatives are much smaller. You have to look for them. The recipes are always, or a lot of the times, including meat as the standard option, stating that you can add an alternative, etc., etc. And that all states that consuming meat is the standard option. So there are a lot of other options to support behavior change that go beyond these drivers, and there is a lot of focus on them, whereas the amount of options is much bigger.
Thank you for that so much, Marlene. So at this point in the conversation, is there still time for more questions to our panelists? Okay. So there's some opportunity, some fertile ground for controversy on this panel. As we know, have somebody working with animal-based meat, animal-sourced food producers, procurers, and distributors. And we have 2 members who are attempting to replace animal-sourced food in their respective company and organizational missions. So let me try to frame it this way. In 2019, a couple years ago, there were 2 major reports from the IPCC. The special report on global warming under 1.5 degrees Celsius and the special report on climate change and land. And from what I took, something mentioned in the executive summaries of those respective reports are 2 major steps that we need to take within food systems to limit global warming and land expansion. One of those steps is predominantly for high-income countries that are already consuming a lot of meat, which is eat substantially less of it. Not eliminate it necessarily, but eat substantially less of it. And another recommendation for both high-income and developing countries is to improve the efficiency and sustainability of meat production. So what I would love to know from some of our panelists who work in these areas is, do you see an inherent tension in your respective role? Is improving animal source food production at odds with reducing its production and consumption, or are they compatible? And how do you think about that compatibility or contradiction in your respective roles? So Steve, could we start with you there?
Sure. Well, as a food distributor, we're in business to sell whatever the restaurant wants to sell. So we carry multiple brands of plant-based proteins. I'm sure we're a big customer of Oatly. I would imagine we're in their top 10 easily. But we have seen a fairly leveled sales pattern on our plant-based products. Part of that's driven by price. And as we get into, tougher economic times, that's certainly going to be a headwind. But we make as much selling plant-based as we do animal protein. So we want to sell what the customer wants to buy. That's our business. But we've seen our growth in animal protein far exceeding our growth in plant-based protein over the last several years. And in fact, during COVID, animal-based protein absolutely exploded. The demand for it was unbelievable. Wow. Partly because animal-based protein is a comfort food and people cook it at home, and they were looking to have something that brought them a little bit of comfort. So actually, but we push plant-based products as well, and we sell quite a bit of them, but the growth has not been as fast.
So we're seeing some contradiction here in terms of goals and consumer preferences and behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, so for full disclosure, I grew up on a cattle farm. My expertise, if I have one, is in pasture-based livestock systems, but I'm largely a pescatarian. So this conflict you're talking about lives in my head all the time. I actually think that both of these approaches to mitigating the current impact of our livestock systems, all the while product developers and manufacturers are developing products that just innately have different footprints. They have to happen simultaneously. You are not going to move the American consumer off of livestock-based products anytime soon. I mean, we are a center of the plate protein culture, and that's very different from much of the world, but that's the American culture. As an example of what can happen, we had more dairy cows in this country in 1947 than any time before or after that, because every one of those cows was only producing about 5,000 pounds of milk per year. The modern dairy cow produces 28,000 pounds of milk per year on average. That's happened through genetics, better management. Now, that cow has a pretty big eco footprint, no question about it. But because she produces so much more than she used to, the eco footprint per gallon of milk is nowhere near what it used to be. So we have to work toward all of these things while consumers figure out a new value system. I should also say, and I'm not saying this to be controversial or to land on one side of this or the other, the only sector in American agriculture where small-scale family farm producers, small-scale, still figure in any way importantly into the larger food system is in livestock. beef cattle producers. Most cattle coming into American feedlots come from very, very small American cow-calf producers. If we transitioned entirely to plant-based agriculture, we are beholden to the Midwest and California almond groves for our entire food system. Just something to think about.
So there certainly are some, a big theme of today has been trade-offs. And you mentioned a pretty major trade-off with respect to livelihoods versus kind of ecological footprint, as you framed it there. I would love to hear, since we were just talking about cattle, a little bit more from Julie about how you think of threading the needle on these tensions or just kind of flying over their head. So anything you'd love to contribute, Julie. Thank you.
In very complicated debates like this that are quite I think pointed and emotional for people, I try to rely on sort of what the data are telling me. I think we know from global research, from the IPCC, from various scholars, that the food industry globally is responsible for about a third of global greenhouse gas emissions. We know that animal products contribute more than half of that load. They use about 3/4 of the land used globally for food production while yielding less than 20% of globally consumed calories. And as a result of that, many international coalitions, whether that's the Lancet report or the IPCC, have encouraged a transition towards eating more plants. I am going to say I work for a company that believes that making products that are produced from oats, which itself is a crop that many, many farmers in North America produce, that tend not to be irrigated, that tend to use lower chemical input loads than some other comparable commodities, is a good basis for the products that we provide. And what I want to do is link this conversation to what Marlene was talking about earlier, which is at the end of the day, we have to have things that are delicious and that people want to eat, that taste good, and with which they have an emotional connection. And I think that a set of products like Oatly, hit all of those spots. I mean, I'm not here to, sell my company, but just to say, we try to produce products that are delicious, that people want to eat and drink, that don't feel like any kind of a sacrifice, that people find delight in. And we ourselves, as anybody who has, seen any of our brand out there, are, like a very irreverent, quirky, personable company that, sort of try to interact with people in ways that are, delightful and sort of feel like they're fun and interesting and a great sort of brand to interact with. So I think, we can be both science-based and also delicious. And I think the combination of those things means we need to be a little bit fearless in these spaces and sort of call out what we think the research is telling us. So I think that's what I would say.
Can I say real quick that Oatly is an example of how change will happen? If it's not happening through policy, it is sophisticated food and beverage product development that meets consumer demand for price, flavor, and convenience, and checks off some boxes on values-based buying. And so that's the power. Gabe, you started this session by saying that consumers are incredibly powerful. I don't think they are. I actually think the power lies in the influencers, which, because we're moving way closer toward a consumer packaged good dominated type food industry, I think it's product developers and food scientists that can incorporate these really important values into what consumers eat.
That is a really interesting point, that packaged goods companies are holding more of the value additions and the power in the food system. And it also makes me think about a lot of the recent backlash we're hearing against all manner of foods, from animal to largely plant-based kind of substitutes and alternatives being ultra processed, being overly packaged, and there being a lot of stigma, and particularly in the nutrition space, whether that's going to really hold water or be part of the movement of what consumers themselves are going to want. This is something that I think about very often as, I research the role of food systems and livestock on planetary change. One of the most obvious substitutes that a lot of folks are saying may come down the line are these plant-based meats. And there's a rising backlash saying that these are overly processed and sometimes unnutritious products. And there's a lot of kind of fact and fiction being thrown into that. And there is some science in that debate, but it is largely an aesthetic one. And aesthetics really do seem to drive a lot of consumer behavior. So on that note, I want to provide this opportunity for Emma and Marlene to throw in something there if you were sitting on an observation from last. And if not, it might be a good time to go to audience Q&A. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks. I'd like to circle back to the climate conversation because I think we're all in agreement that the world is not going to get to net zero emissions without addressing food and land. And I just wanted to highlight the role that alternative proteins can play in that. So we agree that animal agriculture causes like a substantial percentage of global greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that an agricultural transition towards alt proteins could significantly reduce emissions, starting with, growing crops for alternative protein end products versus feed crops for livestock. So that switch can eliminate massive inefficiencies, and primary crop ingredients can be converted directly into those end products. And I wanted to draw a parallel also to renewable energy. So once upon a time, renewable energy was an emerging market solution. But as the business opportunity and environmental benefits and advantages and mitigating material business risks have become clear, renewable energy solutions have attracted trillions of dollars in investments. And when you compare to renewable energy, institutions are underinvesting in alternative proteins as a climate solution. So from 2011 to 2020, global investments in alternative proteins amounted to about $6 billion compared to a staggering $1.8 trillion in renewable energy investments. Meanwhile, annual US energy and meat market revenues are actually strikingly similar, which just shows how underinvested we are in food system solutions to climate change. And I just wanted to highlight that I think that now is really the time to begin managing those food system climate risks. And I think that investing in open source R&D that can lead to the great tasting and scalable alternative protein products can be a considerable tool in our climate toolbox.
All right. Thank you for that, Emma. I would love the opportunity to take at least one audience question at this point, if anyone has a question for our panelists.
Anybody in the crowd with a question? All right, we got a couple over here.
Hi, so I have a question either for Steve or for Jason regarding the livestock industry. So as Jason told us, consumer behavior will shape the market, and we're seeing an increased consciousness on the consumer side about the impact of the things that they buy. So ultimately, at some point, I think this is going to affect the livestock industry. So I think it's going to have to move towards more sustainable practices, but I want to know what practices are being made right now, other than increasing productivity in the livestock industry, that will take them towards a more sustainable, turning more sustainable overall.
Well, there's lots of technologies and lots of experimentation going on in that area. For example, in one of our feedlots, we're using digesters that take manure and turn it into potable water and granular fertilizer. And the manure then is not going into lagoons, it's not going into watersheds, that kind of thing. A lot of activity around that. But there's also a lot of conversation about what is sustainability. When we talk about animal agriculture, are we talking about net zero reduction, or are we talking about actual carbon sequestration? Because livestock create topsoil. And the reason you've got such fertile land in the Midwest is because buffalo grazed on that land for centuries and created a lot of topsoil because of the manure and the cloven hoof. And so are we looking at net zero, or are we looking at carbon sequestration? We've got to get our definitions of what's driving policy and economic change.
So I would follow, and I'm not going to quote numbers because they're not in my head, but this assertion that the consumer really, in a statistically significant way, cares more about what they're eating and its impact than they did at some time in the past, I'm not sold that that's actually the truth. I do look at raw data about how much, for instance, added sugar we eat and how much that went up in just the last 5 or 10 years, which is basically the Dunkin' Donuts and Starbucks effect. Coffee is no longer coffee. Coffee is caramel, mocha, whatever, with lots of sugar in it. And it's 3 times the added sugar consumption in this country is 3 times the daily consumption of dark green vegetables. I think we have some real problems. And I think the externalities of the nutritional value of what we're eating that generates huge healthcare costs and loss of life and chronic disease. I almost think we have, even though no question about it, the climate crisis is real, it's scary, and it's going to decimate the global economy. No question that that's true. I think we've got a first tier problem to figure out, and that is, how do you get a consumer to care about what their eating habit does to the environment when you can't get them to care about what it does to their length of life?
Or maybe they do care about it, but the daily dissonance between their long-term goals and their daily decision making is really what's being kind of most palpable, which
Sure.
I'm grateful for Marlene's research in that respect.
Yeah.
I will add to the fact that doing a study out to 2050, right now, those nutrition externalities are orders of magnitude greater. But by 2050, we're going to see the kind of carbon costs of our food emissions really approach those nutrition externalities.
Oh, I don't doubt it.
Yeah, absolutely. So do we have time for one more question? Or?
Yep, we have one more question. We have a good question from the chat,
Okay,
and then we'll probably wrap it up. So this one is really for anybody, but probably more for the ladies on the screen. What is the best way to make plant-based alternatives accessible and desirable to low-income consumers? It seems that many products in this category are either expensive or viewed as such. Now, this was kind of touched on, but figured we'd throw it in there anyways.
I'd like to.
Oh, great.
Yes. So we indeed did some research in comparing different consumer groups, and this is a very relevant question because we indeed see that especially meat reducing strategies are already conducted by well-informed high-income groups. Though that these lower income groups, vulnerable groups are especially meat lovers. They are really consuming a lot of meat, which in potential is quite dangerous because it might increase gaps between different groups of consumers, for example, in terms of healthiness. There are already alternatives, for example, beans and pulses or linses. I'm not sure whether I translated correctly, but very unprocessed meat alternatives can be very cheap. But these groups are very difficult to reach on the strategies we use at this moment. So it's really a difficult and good question because this diversity between groups is really prominent problem at this point.
I'd love to add on that. Yeah. So I definitely think that taste and price both remain really big barriers to plant-based meat consumption. We see plant-based meat pound per pound today on average is twice as expensive as conventional meat. And the vast majority of consumers think that conventional meat tastes better. And in a lot of these areas, we can see that increased R&D and simple scaling of the industry can help deliver on competitive taste and cost. So things like agronomic yield improvement and process and facility scaling, scaling the novel protein supply chains, experimenting with new ingredient types like duckweed and seaweed and pea protein, sharing supply chains, developing low-cost extraction measures to get the protein out of the raw ingredient, and also de-risking crop production. So we saw a huge downturn in the amount of pea protein produced in the past year from Canada and France because of massive weather anomalies, right? Drought in Canada, extreme wet weather in France. And because plant-based meat is such an emerging category still, those incidents can have an outsized effect on, the resilience of the supply chain. So the most important thing here is that we can continue to scale up the supply chain and invest in a supply chain that is resilient to a lot of the sort of anomalies that might happen on the small scale. And by doing that, we can create the trajectory that allow the products to become taste and price competitive with conventional proteins.
If I could just jump in very briefly, I know we're nearing the end of the time, but just to say two things. One, a general point, which is that if the true cost of food were actually accounted for, the price discrepancy between these categories of products would look a lot different. That I think relates back to the policy conversation we had earlier in this session. And I think from the perspective of a brand like Oatly, the other key element to this is meeting people where they are and being present in the markets and in the venues that people are likely to encounter and be able to have this option. So in our case, we only entered the markets in the US and China about 5 years ago. When we did, the oat category in general was like a rounding error in, the world of plant-based milks. It's now the fastest growing plant-based milk in both of those markets. And we ourselves, just as a single brand, are available in more than 140,000 locations in 20 different countries. And that includes not just, maybe niche places that people would think of, but 7-Eleven, McDonald's in Asia, KFC in Asia, Target, Walmart, CVS, Major League Baseball teams. So, I think a big part of the answer to the question, at least of accessibility, is, going to meeting people where they are and where they're likely to make these choices.
Thank you for that, both Julie and Emma. And Emma, your last comment about a relatively smaller supply chain that is not resilient to climate shocks really does make me believe that there's more breadth to have this conversation around effective public policies in transformed food chains. But that's a conversation for another day. With that, I'd love to thank our panelists, especially our keynote contributor, but everyone, the organizers, and I'll give it back to Gabriel.
Thank you, everyone, so much for your participation. I know that I don't need the camera on me right now, so I just want to say to you guys, one of the things that I love probably the most of this whole conversation was we don't have to wait. And that's a very important thing to remember, that change does not need to be waited upon. When I emailed all these panelists, I said, quite frankly, we wanted to have a real conversation. We wanted to go beyond the platitudes and really dig deep and get our hands dirty. And I think we've done that. And I'm very, very thankful for all of you to take your time here and devote it to us, especially Marlene. I know it's probably very late there. So thank you so much yet again. I'm going to adjust the camera. We'll take it like 30 seconds. And then we're going to play a video. Actually, I can just go right into the video, I guess, with our speaker who is supposed to be shown over lunch, Miss Kizzy Charles Guzman. So without further ado, thank you guys so much. Can we give him one last round of applause? Okay, so first, some back.